Our reading for this morning takes us into the Gospel of Mark chapter 9, where Jesus shows his disciples what true greatness looks like. The disciples went on from there and passed through Galilee, and Jesus did not want anyone to know, for he was teaching his disciples, saying to them, "The Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men, and they will kill him. And when he is killed, after 3 days, he will rise." But they did not understand the saying and were afraid to ask him. And they came to Capernaum. And when he was in the house, he asked them, "What were you discussing on the way?" But they kept silent, for on the way they had argued with one another about who was the greatest. And he sat down and called the 12. And he said to them, "If anyone would be first, he must be last of all and servant of all." And he took a child and put him in the midst of them. And taking him in his arms, he said to them, "Whoever receives one such child in my name receives me. And whoever receives me receives not me, but him who sent me." This is the word of the Lord. One more week of that. All right, but with that in mind, let's look at our text. And I have some words I want us to meditate on throughout this message. Jesus says, "If anyone would be first, he must be last of all and servant of all." Please pray with me. May the words of my mouth and the meditation of all our hearts be ever pleasing and acceptable in your sight, O Lord. Amen. So after Jesus tells of his death and resurrection the second time, the disciples react in a very unique way. They start talking about who is the greatest? Who is the greatest among them? Now, even though they disagreed with each other about that answer, they all agreed that the greatest among them was Jesus. And I think it's pretty evident why. Because, well, we can ask the question, what makes someone great? And we could probably land on what the disciples came up with. Well, what makes Jesus great? Well, first off, Jesus has power. He's God. He can do literally anything. Through Jesus' mouth at the beginning of time, the world was spoken into being. Jesus healed people. We've been tracking that over these last few months. He gives sight to the blind, hearing to the deaf. He even raises the dead. He has power. Another thing that made him great is his public influence. I mean, people literally came from everywhere and anywhere. They brought their friends. They brought the most unlikely people to hear the words of Jesus. And so many people hang on to those words so closely that lives en masse were changed through those words. Another thing that made Jesus great was his, approval. Well, we do know that his disapproval is what would eventually get him killed, but he had a lot of approval. People followed him everywhere. If he had an X account or an Instagram account, he'd probably have the most followers of anyone on social media. But then the last thing that makes Jesus great is his achievements. Well, it's one thing when you take the sin of the whole world on your shoulders, take that to death and rise again so we can have new life. I don't know a greater achievement than that. But that was his essentially life goal, his life achievement. And he did it. These are the things that made Jesus great. Okay. So let's use that same metric and see how the world thinks about that. What makes someone great? I think we see that crossover. I'm going to put some images up here of people. And the reason I'm putting these images up is because this is probably what a lot of people would say are examples of greatness. And I can understand where they're coming from. I don't think ill of anybody I'm going to put up here, but this is to make the point. Look in the top left. Something that's great. How about power? We have an office in this country where an individual holds probably the most power of anyone. Choices that they and their cabinet make can have ripple effects, not immediately, but for generations to come. The things they say, those little decisions, can change many lives in a matter of hours. Another thing, if we look at the top right, is influence. If you want to look for a man who had a great influence on this country, whose influence still holds today, none other than Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. His words, the things that he said, his dream would become a reality not long after his life was unfortunately taken, because he saw people for the content of their character and not for the color of their skin. Let's also look at, so we have influence, let's also look at approval. You know, I saw an interesting article just the other day. Did you know that 53% of adults in this country are fans of Taylor Swift? 53%. There was a poll that was recently taken. And of that 53%, 44 of them called themselves Swifties. So, you're not one of that 44, are you? Oh, is it 47? Is it? You're the 47. Okay. There we go. Well, you can see just the approval and the greatness that has. And I mean, when you look at greatness, you look at approval, and who other than Taylor Swift? But then on the bottom there, on the bottom right, we have an example of achievement. So for those of you who don't know who that is on the bottom right, that's Jensen Huang. He is the co-founder and CEO of NVIDIA, which is a massive tech company, probably one of the most valuable in the world now. Stocks that continually soar and seem not to be plateauing much. The occasional drop here and there, but in other words, you look at what they produce, they are unrivaled in their AI tech. And Jensen Huang is the epitome of what so many people would consider greatness. A man who has hit his lifetime achievements and exceeded them, and there seems to be no showing of him slowing down anytime soon. If you ask the world, these people up here are examples of greatness. And that's exactly how the disciples asked that question. That's how the disciples would have answered this question. What makes someone great? Well, a few stories ago, we know that Peter, James, and John were up on the Mount of Transfiguration. This is where Jesus took his three closest disciples, and he took them up to a mountain, and there they got to see a glimpse of Jesus in his divine nature. I mean, his perfect and pure glory, something any of us have yet to see. And so I imagine that experience for them could have sparked this conversation. Maybe a few of the guys who didn't get to go up were wondering, are they greater than us? Or maybe they themselves were being a little arrogant and said, oh, we're greater than them. We don't know how it started, but we do know this. Jesus was listening, but he also knew what they were talking about. He knows their hearts. He can read minds. Remember, he's got power. And he said, so what you all talking about? And I love their response. You know what their response is? Nothing. Nothing. It was guilt. Because they knew that those metrics they were using for greatness, they were applying to themselves. And that only stems from one thing. It stems from pride. Self-pride. A pride that puts the self first. But of course, if we are elevating ourselves with power, approval, influence, and then finally with achievement, well, there isn't much place for God, is there? Because it's about me. The disciples knew what was going on, and they knew where Jesus was going with that. Well, Jesus then teaches them a very valuable lesson about greatness. He answers that question, what makes someone great? And to do that, he begins by identifying someone great. But it's not JFK. It's not Ronald Reagan. It's not MLK. It's not, Miss Swift. It certainly isn't Jensen Huang. He picked a child up. Now, for us, in our day and age, comparative throughout history, we value children quite a bit, which is great. But if you look at Jewish society in Jesus' day, children were second class. Children were seen but not heard. One Jewish scholar that lived in the time of Jesus even famously wrote that to waste your time, that one of the worst ways to waste your time is to chat with a child. Well, Jesus didn't like that very much because he knew that wasn't true. So what did he do? He grabbed a young boy and he held this kid and he goes, if you want to know, and these are not the exact words he used. He said, if you want to know what greatness is, it's this little guy. It's not the one at the top. It's the one who serves the likes of these children. The one that people don't care about. The ones that are considered at the bottom of society. That's what makes someone great. He must be a servant to all. Now, that word receives, Dan so well articulated that and showed that it's the word welcomes. Those who welcome a child like this. Those who welcome a homeless person, those who welcome somebody in need, those who welcome that person who voted the opposite political party in the last election, those who welcome the one who doesn't like Jesus. Those are great people. And so Jesus then fleshes that out a little further, but let's stick with our metrics that we used earlier for what makes someone great. Greatness in the eyes of Jesus is, well, a child. Let's look at some of those positive qualities of children. And yes, I realize this is not perfect, just a disclaimer, but work with me here. Instead of greatness being in power, what if greatness is in submission? What if it's a submission to God, to recognizing who our Father is, and we are his child? And well, a good child is obedient. They're submissive to the will and the words of their father, regardless of how they feel, regardless of what they'd rather be doing. They're obedient. They're submissive. That's what a great person does. And rather than having greatness be public influence, how many followers can you get? How many likes? How many people can you reach? What if it's immediate influence? I simply mean the people that God has already put in your life. And parents, I think the first obvious one is your kids. That's probably the people you can set the closest example for, because they know you far better than anyone who might know you on the internet. And it's those things. It's the people who you don't think are watching. Those are the ones where you can show greatness. People in your life. Greatness, rather than seeking approval from everyone, what if greatness is actually faithfulness? It doesn't matter what people think or don't think of you. What matters is what God says is right. And even more so, we know that we can believe what God said is right because, well, he's faithful to us. And then lastly, let's look at that achievement thing. Greatness is not found in self-achievement. Maybe it's found in surrender. Surrendering our crowns, surrendering our degrees, surrendering those things we think makes us great, which elevates us in a certain position. And rather, it's giving the glory to someone else. I look through each of these things, and I realize that I have failed many times in those 4 categories that I just put up there. But I do know something. I do that even though I am not great, I am not perfect, I make plenty of mistakes, I know that Jesus is both of these lists. He is all-powerful. He does have the greatest influence. He does call us, and he does have a lot of people approve, and he's achieved the greatest things, but that's not who he calls us to be. He calls us to that yellow category. That is the greatness. And if you want the perfect example of that, you can go back to verses 30 to 32 at the beginning of our reading, because Jesus shows us perfect submission. Submission to people who don't deserve him, who don't love him, who would kill him. Jesus shows us that importance of those one-on-one relationships as he talked with Pilate, as he may have interacted with those Roman soldiers that pinned him down, with Caiaphas, with his disciples. We see that faithfulness, that even though Jesus deserved all glory, deserved all honor, deserved approval from all of creation, he did his Father's will and gave it all up. He was faithful to his Father, which led to that perfect surrender. Brothers and sisters, God is great. And he makes us great because he did it first. God shows us that we can be submissive. Why? Because he fully submits himself to us every single day. In our needs, he provides for us. God is constantly influencing us with his word. He has that word present for us every day, and it's unfortunate if we don't take time with that word just to hear what he wants to tell us. He remains faithful to us even when we struggle, and more importantly, every day, just as he surrendered. He calls you to surrender to that will. It's a daily thing. You know, I know some great people in my life, and again, it's not because of what they did, it's what Christ did through them, and I'll give you one. It's actually my grandpa. I called him Opa, though. He's German. And, you'd probably never know about him because he wouldn't have been labeled great in the eyes of the world. He wasn't in front of everybody. But he knew what it was to submit. He knew what it was to listen to authority, even if he didn't fully agree with it. He lived during World War II in Nazi Germany. He had to fight and wrestle with with the leadership telling him what to do and figure out how to be faithful to God. He had a positive influence on everyone he interacted with because he always put them first. It wasn't about him being elevated. It was about the other people whom he could show Jesus to so much that other people who knew him knew that he was a follower of God. He was always faithful, even in uniform, even in prison, when he was captured. And he knew that at the end of the day, whether he deserved greatness, whether he didn't, his job was to give up his achievements and surrender it all to the will of God, his wealth, his prestige, those things. So much so that all of these things I'm telling you, most of these things I did not know till after he died. I heard them from other people. That's what greatness looks like. Not because my Opa was great, because God was great for him and showed him greatness. So what does that mean for you? It means seek greatness. But what kind of greatness are you looking for? Are you looking for that first category? Or are you looking for the Christ-like category? I assure you that in that first category, there may be some wonderful things in this world to experience, but there's no promise we'll get it. But God promises far more when we submit it in that childlike faith. He promises us not only that his greatness will show through us, but that other people will see his greatness in us. And even more, we'll get to fully experience what that looks like in his kingdom. Seek greatness, but Jesus' greatness. Amen.